Hey and welcome gurus to this demo lesson, Implement Azure Firewall Policies. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to start off by learning about implementing Azure Firewall Policies and a case study scenario using our Control-Alt-Suites organization. And then we're going to go through the demo steps that we will take for this lesson, and we'll bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. So to get started with our Control-Alt-Suites Azure Cloud Sandbox environment, we're starting off with the Hub VNet that we're familiar with our virtual machine in the Hub subnet, and an Azure Firewall resource and an Azure Firewall subnet. Now this is a classically implemented Azure Firewall, much like our previous demo. We're actually going to be migrating it over to a policy-based rule management style for our firewall that's managed by Azure Firewall Manager. And then off to the side, as we're familiar with, we have our Spoke VNet, and this has a peering connection between our Hub VNet, and that way these two can communicate, and also we'll have a route table that is associated with the subnets that have our virtual machine in both the Hub and Spoke network, routing traffic to our firewall resource. We also will have our rules existing on our firewall, so those rules will migrate over. Now, let's take a look at the demo steps that we're going to go through. We're going to actually do the migration process, but also create a policy for ourselves, and then we're going to take a look at creating a rule collection group and a rule collection, and those rules inside of that rule collection using the various types of rule collections, and then we're going to apply that policy to our firewall resource and evaluate how that affects our rules. And again, this is very similar to implementing those classically managed rules, but instead we're abstracting it away to a policy resource so that we have less administrative overhead, so that we can reuse this same policy resource and associate it with multiple firewalls at the same time for reusability of our rules. Again, this is to decrease our administrative overhead. Now, as always, the setup is available in the resources of this lesson, so make sure to grab that. And at this point, let's make our way over to the Azure Cloud Sandbox and get started. All right, gurus, here we are in the Azure Cloud Sandbox. We're logged in and we have a storage account here, and this is configured with our Cloud Shell. So we'll open up our Cloud Shell here. And if you have anything in your Cloud Shell, just type in clear and clear up your display. And the very first thing that we're going to do is get that resources file under the resources of this lesson. Once you've got it, open it up, select everything, copy it, bring it back to the Cloud Shell, and paste it in. And this is going to ask us to provide information such as our admin username. I'll provide mine, make sure to provide yours, and then provide your password here. It's going to take it as a secure string for you, and you can use whatever password you'd like. And then hit enter, and this is going to go off and deploy all of our resources. So using some video editing magic, we're going to jump ahead to when those resources have finished deploying. All right, gurus, so we're back and our deployment is finished. So we'll minimize our Cloud Shell here, and we'll see our resources here inside of our resource group. If you don't, hit refresh, and you should see them here, and you can minimize this portion right here, the essentials, and this way you have a better view of what's going on inside of your resources. We'll sort by type here, and if we come down to the bottom, we see we have our Hub and Spoke VNet, and then we have our Hub and Spoke VM, each inside of a subnet inside of the Hub and Spoke VNet. We have our storage account for our Cloud Shell. We have a route table that routes traffic from these virtual machines and their subnets back to the firewall resource, and our firewall has a public IP address, and we have a Bastion public IP because we are going to use a Bastion to access both of these VMs because their NICs don't have public IPs, just private IPs. We have some IP groups so that we can kind of see how those take place in creating rules. Then we have our firewall resource, our VM disks, and our Bastion resource itself. So the first thing we'll do is go into our firewall here, and we see what we have is a classic rule management style firewall. If we click into the rules here, we see we don't have a NAT rule, we do have a network rule, and we do have an application rule. And what we're going to be doing from here is we're going to be migrating this over to policy-based rule management so that it can be managed by Firewall Manager. So we'll go over to our overview again, and we're going to quickly take note that our resource is in West US. We'll click migrate to firewall policy. And what we see down here is that the parent policy must be in the same region as the child policy. However, firewall policies can be associated with firewalls across regions regardless of where they're stored. So this does not have to be West US because our firewall is in West US. It could be in a different region than our firewall. But if we were using a parent policy and we were making sure that we were putting that in the same region as our child policy, that way they could work together. So I'm just going to leave it as West US here, accept the default naming, click review and create. It's going to validate this deployment. And then I'm going to click create, and this is going to go off and migrate this firewall from classic-based role management to policy-based role management. And this can take about 15 to 30 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and skip to when that's complete and then get started with creating our NAT role. All right, gurus, so we're back and our firewall has finished migrating over from classic role management to policy-based role management. So we'll go into this policy resource here, and under settings, if we look at our rule collections, what we're going to see here is that we have 3 default rule collection groups, one for DNAT, network, and then one for application. And under the network and application rule collection groups, each has the rule collection and the rule that existed inside of that rule collection. For example, if we look at NAT collection, we see that the net collection has our rule that existed before. We exit out, same thing with the app collection here. Exit out, but this is because we had these rule collections on the existing firewall when we migrated over. We do not have a DNAT rule collection, and that's what's going to bring us into actually creating our child policy. We're going to create a child policy for this policy here that we created when we migrated over, and this will be the parent policy. So real fast, let's come up to the search bar, type in policies, and select firewall policies. We'll click create here, taking note that the location of this policy is in West US. And also it's important to remember this is a standard tier parent policy here. So we'll click create, we'll select our resource group, and we're going to call this our test parent firewall policy. And I know that naming is confusing. This is a child policy, not a parent policy, but it is going to be used to test our parent policy. So we'll just leave it at that. And then we'll choose our region here. West US, it's got to be in the same region as the parent policy. So in this case it is. And then we'll come to our policy tier here. We see we have standard and premium. And if we look under the standard policies, we'll see that we have the existing parent policy. And if you don't see the policy, select standard here and it should pop up for you under standard policies. So we'll select that. We'll click next into our DNS settings, and on our policies, we can manage those DNS settings that we would typically manage on our firewall. So we could choose to enable custom DNS servers or provide DNS proxy. We'll leave it at disabled. Then we'll move into TLS inspection here, and we see with TLS inspection, this is a feature that's only supported by premium policies, and we could use it to enable TLS settings to perform TLS inspection so that we can decrypt and inspect the traffic and then re-encrypt it and send it onto its path. We're going to click next into rules here, and here's where we see we could choose to create other rules as well as see the rules that are inherited from the parent policy. So we see all these rules here that are inherited, and we see we can add a rule collection. So we'll do that in just a moment. We'll skip ahead to the IDPS for intrusion detection prevention systems, and we see this is a feature that's supported by premium policies only, and this can be set to disabled, alert whenever we see suspicious traffic, or alert and deny when we see suspicious traffic. And then next up, we have our threat intelligence. And threat intelligence allows us to filter based on threat intelligence that's enabled on the firewall to alert and block traffic from known malicious IPs and domains. And we can set allowed IPs and domains here. And we also will see the ones that are inherited from our parent policy. And then we can choose the threat intelligence mode of alert only or alert and deny. We're not going to set any of this. We'll click next into tags. We'll click review and create. Let it validate the deployment of this child policy and click create. And it's going to go off and create this child policy for us with that association to the parent policy we just created. All right, gurus. Now at this point, while that's creating, we're going to actually break this lesson into 2 parts just due to the duration of the lesson. So we're going to stop here and pick up in the next lesson, part 2, where we're going to continue with Azure Firewall Policy demo.